Both these aircraft evolved in completely different ways to go head-to-head in the skies over England during the summer of 1940. So which design was the right one for the job in hand? Which aircraft was the superior flyer? And which one was the better weapon of war? The Battle of Britain lasted 3 months over the summer of 1940, and it's during this period that we're comparing the two aircraft. On the drawing board, they seem superbly matched, but it was in the air that combat would take place. Here, armament, performance and handling would be decisive factors. The Messerschmitt was already battle-proven, but what would the RAF's pilots make of their brand new Spitfire?
Oh, I loved it. The most beautiful airplane that's ever built, I think. You didn't get into the Spitfire, you strapped it on and flew. The best part was it was so wonderful to handle. It was a viceless airplane. It had no vices at all. You could do anything with it, and it would do anything you wanted it to do.
Comparing the Spitfire's handling to the Messerschmitt's requires someone who's flown both aircraft. Pilot Charlie Brown has done just that.
The Spitfire is the ultimate carefree handling airplane. Getting it off the ground and getting it back onto the ground is a bit of a trick, I grant you. But in the air, it is the most benign airplane of any type that I've ever flown. Of any type.
It was the Spitfire's trademark elliptical wings that gave it its responsive handling.
Take a look at those two airplanes. Look at the wing area. The Spitfire's got that wonderful elliptical section on it. And in theory, when you start to maneuver the airplane, you should get less drag. It is one of the things that makes the aircraft more benign, having that large wing area.
The Messerschmitt's wings were smaller and weaker than the Spitfire's. What's more, a fluke design feature of the Spitfire gave its pilots an overwhelming advantage. During extreme maneuvers, the wings gave a judder, warning that the plane was about to fall out of the sky, giving the pilot ample time to correct. The Messerschmitt gave no such warning.
The 109 is definitely more of a handful. It is rather less gamely. There is less feedback through the controls. Perfectly fine flying machine, but compared to a Spitfire, it is very difficult.
You had to treat the Messerschmitt as you would treat a diva. You had to handle it with care, just like a raw egg, or like something that needs to be loved and cared for.
Because the Messerschmitt was trickier to fly, its pilots were often reluctant to take it to the limits. And it's this fact that could shed light on one of the most enduring controversies surrounding the two aircraft. Which one could outturn the other?
In a turn, the Spit was better than the Messerschmitt.
I know the Spitfire could outturn the 109. You'll still find the odd 109 pilot who claimed differently, but I'm sure they hadn't found competent Spitfire pilots against them.
So, which one was the tighter turner? Despite vociferous claims otherwise by the Spitfire pilots, there's some evidence to suggest that the 109 could outturn the British fighter. But in a dogfight at 20,000 feet, only the most experienced Luftwaffe pilot would have the confidence to push his plane to the very limits, whereas even a novice RAF pilot trusted the feedback he received from the benign handling Spitfire. So, in a dogfight, 9 times out of 10, the Spitfire would outturn the Messerschmitt, and this often meant the difference between life and death.
A number of times a Spitfire being chased by Messerschmitt pulled a tight turn, and the Messerschmitt couldn't stay with it. And in some cases, more experienced pilots ended up shooting a Messerschmitt down.
As far as handling is concerned, the Spitfire was the more forgiving, and that gave it a crucial advantage over the 109, which required an experienced pilot to take it to the limits. The outcome of the Battle of Britain didn't just hinge on the quality of the aircraft, it also depended on the survival of its pilots too. How well protected were they by their planes? To compare the aircraft from the pilot's point of view, we've asked a German pilot to step into a Spitfire and a British airman to climb into a Messerschmitt's cockpit to give their personal views on their opposite numbers aircraft. First, Spitfire pilot Peter Fay climbs into one of the few remaining serviceable Bf109s in the world, currently being prepared to fly.
I feel very much more confined than I did in a Spit, but the control panel is very similar.
Next, Battle of Britain Luftwaffe ace Hans Eckhart Bob gives his first impressions of the Supermarine Spitfire.
Ja, also ich muss sagen.
Well, I must admit that I like it. It's pretty spacious in here. When the cabin is closed, you feel safe. But what is also important is your rear view, because that's where the enemy comes from. And when I turn round, I have good visibility on both sides, which is very important.
Alles okay.
Visibility, not as good as a Spitfire. And if I look round, yes, I can see, but there's a definite blind spot.
This blind spot was caused by the armour plate fitted behind the pilot's head, and many Messerschmitt pilots complained that it made them vulnerable to surprise attacks. It wasn't until after the Battle of Britain that this was cleverly rectified by the introduction of panzer glass taken from German tanks in place of the thick armour plating, and still capable of stopping a bullet. But visibility wasn't the pilot's only concern during the Battle of Britain.
In dieser Maschine ist ja der Tank vor einem.
In this plane, the fuel tank is in front of you, compared to the Messerschmitt, where you have the tank behind and underneath you. If you were hit at the front in the Spitfire, then your face would burn straight away. In the 109, the fire would start at the back. Psychologically, that feels safer.
Glaube ich, ist das günstiger.
Right, my petrol tank is hit and I've got to get out in a hurry. It doesn't really matter whether the tank's in front of me or below. If I'm on fire, I've got to get out. And this thing is very heavy. And remember that we've got an airflow of 200 or 300 miles an hour, possibly more. So I have to get that open, and then I've got to get out of this thing. And I can only go this way. So if the flames are that side, hard luck. So I just get out as quick as I can.
But when Hans had to escape from a burning Messerschmitt, he didn't have to worry about any of these practicalities, as his extraordinary story of survival testifies.
Ich habe also eine B-17 von vorne angegriffen, bin zu nah ran.
I once attacked an American flying fortress head-on, but couldn't avoid it and collided with it. As my 109 disintegrated, I was thrown out of the cockpit. This was at 24,000 feet, so I pulled my ripcord and my parachute opened. All the Americans got out too. All 14 of us floated down to Earth together. Once we landed on German soil, I was taken prisoner with the Americans because my overalls looked similar to theirs. I was in shock and couldn't understand what was happening. It was only when I opened my collar that a German soldier said, "Look, that American's wearing the Iron Cross."
Der hat das Ritterkreuz zum Eisernen Kreuz.
Even when 109 pilots did get back to base safely, one feature of the Messerschmitt's design could still catch them unawares, sometimes with fatal consequences. Unlike the Spitfire, the Messerschmitt's wings weren't strong enough to accommodate the landing gear, so the fuselage housed the undercarriage. But this meant that the track, the distance between the two wheels, was exceptionally narrow and caused accidents on takeoff and landing. Devastatingly for the Germans, these accidents accounted for 5% of all 109 losses during the war. So in terms of handling and pilot survivability, the Spitfire is a clear winner. Can the Messerschmitt claw back the advantage when we pit the two aircraft head-to-head in a Battle of Britain dogfight? During the Battle of Britain, the Messerschmitt Bf109 led the German aerial assault on southern England. Meeting it head-on over the White Cliffs was the revolutionary Supermarine Spitfire. Later, we'll see what a Battle of Britain dogfight really looked like. But first, which of these two aircraft had the edge when it came to firepower? In 1940, along with the Hurricane, the Spitfire was the best-equipped British fighter with an armament of 8 Browning 303 machine guns, 4 in each wing. But the Messerschmitt Bf109 had something far more fearsome, 2 deadly 20mm anti-aircraft cannons.
If you have a cannon, you've only got to have a couple of shells at another airplane, and that airplane's out of action, in effect. Whereas bullets, you have to get an awful lot of bullets through that airplane to make any good. I can prove that with you. I mean, on one occasion, I think the last engagement during the Battle of Britain, and I shot down a Ju-88 over Salisbury Plain. I finished up the 11 bullet holes through my aeroplane, and they'd done no damage at all, although one had gone into the engine, whereas a cannon shell would have knocked me out.
To illustrate what this difference in armament means, we've come to an ordnance testing range to carry out a modern-day test of firepower. This is the Browning 303 machine gun, the same basic design that was fitted to the Spitfire during the Battle of Britain. To see the sort of damage that this inflicted while in the air, we're going to fire it at a piece of Messerschmitt 109. This aluminium is the same thickness as the skin of a 109's wing. Let's see what damage a machine gun burst from a Spitfire will do to it. Despite being a mainstay of the British military during the Second World War, a single burst from a Browning 303 just doesn't have the firepower to seriously damage a piece of aluminium like this. Of course, a Spitfire was equipped with 8 Brownings, but you'd still need to be a crack shot to make them count. But shoehorned into the Messerschmitt's tiny wings were 2 of these, the terrifying 20mm cannon. Let's see what damage something this size can do to a Spitfire. Just look at the state of our aluminium target. The Messerschmitt's 20mm cannon shells have ripped through it, leaving holes the size of 2p pieces. Compare that to these tiny holes left by the Spitfire's machine gun. If this really was part of a Spitfire wing, the pilot would be bailing out by now.
I was scrambled and got into the cloud. If you're actually in the cloud, you can't see a blind thing until you're totally clear of the cloud. Well, I came up underneath 5109s. They were sitting there and watching me coming up and rubbing their hands. And they got me before I broke the cloud, really, so I didn't know what was happening. They hit me from front and behind at the same time. A cannon shell exploded on the parachute I was sitting on, which put a hunk of metal through my right here, which cut the Achilles tendon. A bullet through my shoulder from in front, then another bullet came through from behind and finished up in my hand, and I had a couple of just skims my shins came across in front of me.
Bob was lucky. He bailed out and lived to fight another day. As his story proves, during the Battle of Britain, the 109 was clearly superior in terms of firepower, but could it beat the Spitfire in the performance stakes? During the Battle of Britain, Messerschmitts flying from their bases in northern France would typically go head-to-head with intercepting Spitfires at between 15 and 20,000 feet. At this altitude, their performances were superbly matched. The Spitfire had a top speed of 355 miles an hour, just 7 miles an hour quicker than the 109. But the Spitfire's Merlin engine had an Achilles heel, which undoubtedly cost some RAF pilots their lives during those aerial dogfights of 1940. Peter Grieve tours air shows, giving demonstrations of his Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, which he bought as a wreck 6 years ago and restored to full working condition. And he can use it to illustrate the potentially disastrous tendency of the Spitfire's engine to cut out during steep forward dives.
What happens when you put a Spitfire into a steep dive is a bit like the feeling you get when you go over a humpback bridge in the car. Everything gets thrown upwards. In much the same way, on this Merlin carburettor, the fuel gets thrown upwards in the float chamber, starving the engine of fuel momentarily and making it splutter. The next thing which happens is much more serious. Because the floats which control the fuel flow into the carburettor are being thrown around, it makes the carburettor think that it's empty, and the fuel pump just piles fuel into it, in turn flooding the engine, which will make it cut out.
This kind of steep forward dive is known as a negative G maneuver because it reverses the effects of gravity. Using this wartime generator engine, we can demonstrate that the principle of negative G applies in exactly the same way as it does to the Merlin. If you turn the carburettor upside down, the engine cuts out.
Imagine that happening on your aircraft at 16,000 feet.
Crucially, crafty 109 pilots soon learned to exploit this failing of the Spitfire by deliberately pulling this negative G dive as an evasion technique.
It was a great advantage for us that we had a fuel injection system, and the Spitfire was only equipped with a carburettor. When we had a Spitfire behind us which we couldn't shake off, we'd go into a steep forward dive, and the negative G would starve their carburettor. So we could dive quickly, and the Spitfire couldn't keep up.
It was a fault that the Spitfire pilots had to live with until well after the Battle of Britain. But the Spitfire wasn't the only one with a handicap. The 109 had a crippling problem with fuel too, or more precisely, the lack of it. One of the greatest problems faced by the Messerschmitts during the Battle of Britain was limited fuel range. Under here is a Messerschmitt 109 fuel tank, which holds about enough fuel for 15 minutes fighting time over the south of England before the pilot has to head for home, which severely limits the plane's efficiency as a weapon of war.
We had a lot of problems, and we often had to terminate our attacks because we ran out of fuel. The red warning light would come on, and you'd know you only had 10 or 15 minutes left. Critical if you hadn't started your return flight by then. You'd hear anxious cries over the radio from fellow pilots when they saw the light come on. From time to time, people had to make crash landings. It was a big problem for us, a big disadvantage.
So during the summer of 1940, both aircraft suffered from disastrous performance faults that put them on an equal footing. And elsewhere, we've seen that overall, there's little to separate these two fighting machines. But now for the final showdown. We're about to reveal what a typical dogfight between the Spitfire and the Messerschmitt really looked like. Some people like to romanticize the Battle of Britain, but the dogfights of this engagement were a long way from the slow, lyrical, aerobatic dogfights of the First World War. In 1940, it was quick, dirty warfare. Whoever had the height, speed, and most importantly, the element of surprise, was more likely to kill and live to fight another day. Now for the ultimate showdown. In this modern reconstruction, we can finally reveal how these World War II fighters would have performed in a Battle of Britain dogfight. A pair of Messerschmitt 109s heading for the White Cliffs of Dover are about to be intercepted by two Spitfires of RAF's Fighter Command. We now see the following conflict from the cockpit of the second of the Messerschmitts, flown by the number 2 wingman. The four aircraft jostle for position. Because of their restricted rear visibility, it's imperative that the Messerschmitt pilots get behind the Spitfires if they want to win this dogfight. The Messerschmitts get the advantage they need and a chase ensues. The Spitfire pilots, all too aware of the deadly firepower from their attackers' 20mm cannons, use maximum power to stay just out of firing range. But as the two aircraft are roughly equal in terms of top speed, the Spitfires can't increase their lead any further than that. Now the Spitfire's sublime handling comes into its own. The RAF pilots attempt a series of evasive maneuvers to try and shake off the Messerschmitts. However, the one direction they can't go is down. In a forward dive, their carburettor engines would cut out with disastrous consequences. Instead, they'd climb sharply and peel off. But the Luftwaffe pilots anticipate this and have now closed to optimum firing range. A burst from the lead Messerschmitt's 20mm cannon puts a shell through the Spitfire's fuel tank. All too aware of the horrifying prospect of the tank blowing up in his face, the RAF pilot has no choice other than to bail out or make an emergency landing. A victory to the Germans. But before they can turn their attentions to finishing off the second Spitfire, the red lights come on in their cockpits, warning them that fuel is low. They have to head back to their base in northern France, and they assume the second Spitfire will return to its airfield in England. This will prove to be a costly oversight. Caught up in his success, the second Messerschmitt has made a grave mistake. He's neglected to spot the remaining Spitfire making a surprise counterattack from above, leaving the front Messerschmitt fatally vulnerable. The second 109 pilot now has no option but to head back to base alone. The conflict has ended on equal terms, typical of many of the dogfights during the summer of 1940. In fact, the Spitfire and the Messerschmitt were so evenly matched that technically there is no overall winner. Instead, during the Battle of Britain, the deciding factor was the man at the controls.
Und es kommt ja dann am letzten
In the end, a lot depends on the pilot. If you imagine an experienced pilot flying the 109 compared with an inexperienced Spitfire pilot, then the pilot of the 109 will be superior. If the situation was reversed, the Spitfire pilot will be superior. It always depends on who's flying the plane.
You never knew what you were doing. You had a gun sight, and providing that little dot in the middle of the gun sight was where you wanted it to be, how you got there was quite incidental. That is why you had to learn to fly the airplane first, and why these chaps who arrived with 7 hours flying on Spitfires hadn't a hope.
By September 1940, after 3 months of conflict, the Germans realized that without aerial superiority, plans to invade England would have to be abandoned. The history books declare Britain won the battle, but technically it's more accurate to say that the Germans didn't win and the British didn't lose. So for one long, hot summer, the Spitfire and the Messerschmitt Bf109 went head-to-head in the blue skies over southern England and eventually reached a stalemate. Honours were shared.